Hi, I'm Mark, and on this channel I talk about UK politics and Brexit from an outside view, although I do know the UK from the inside as well, so don't worry. Post-Brexit border checks on medium and high-risk goods from the EU were first introduced in April this year, with fruit and vegetables set to be subject to stricter requirements from October this year. However, the Conservative government agreed to extend delay the checks on some categories of fresh produce entering the UK from the EU until January 31st in 2025, citing fears of supply issues and stuff like that. And Labour has now extended that delay for a further 6 months. A statement from the Department for Agriculture and Food said the decision to delay that was necessary to prevent the remaining checks from coming into force by default and to allow the gradual introduction of new checks that benefit traders while ensuring biosecurity. The delay was welcomed by the industry, which had been campaigning for months for a relaxation of fruit and vegetable checks because of rising costs for importers and consumers paying higher prices for food. The chief executive of the Fresh Produce Consortium, that's Nigel Janney, called it a very positive step forward. However, the organization remains deeply concerned that the legacy border strategy fundamentally fails to meet the needs of a highly perishable just-in-time sector. Without urgent change, this approach knowingly places a huge financial burden on our sector and ultimately on hard-pressed consumers, he said. Britain imports more than half of its fruit and vegetable needs. In 2022 alone, 79.4% of vegetable imports came from the EU. And the UK's exit from the European Union has led to a fundamental change in the trading relationship between the two sides. The once smooth movement of goods within the common market has been disrupted by new customs borders, and this development made the introduction of import controls inevitable. The EU had to ensure that goods from the UK met the same high standards as products from other EU member states in order not to distort competition within the single market. And both sides use import controls to impose tariffs on certain goods and thus generate government revenue. The controls are designed to prevent the import of dangerous or prohibited goods and thus ensure the safety of citizens. Both the EU and the UK want to enforce their own standards regarding the environment, health, and consumer protection. But why did the EU react far more quickly? The EU had already been preparing for Brexit for several years and had created the appropriate legal framework. The EU has a strong institutional structure that allows decisions to be implemented quickly, although we always hear the opposite. And the EU had to act quickly to protect the single market from possible disruptions. But why did the UK always delay the introduction? The UK and the government feared negative effects on the economy, especially for companies that have close ties to the EU. Yeah, but they wanted Brexit, and that's the consequence of Brexit. The introduction of comprehensive customs checks is a complex process that poses significant organizational and technical challenges. We've seen that in the EU when they managed that. The UK government wanted to mitigate the social and economic impact of Brexit and tried to make the transition as smooth as possible. And companies have to factor in higher costs for customs formalities, but also for transport and storage. And customs clearance involves a significant amount of bureaucracy, which slows down business processes. And the additional checks can lead to delays in supply chains and affect the availability of goods. The higher costs for companies are in many cases passed on to consumers, leading to rising prices. And the new customs regulations create a certain degree of uncertainty for companies, which have to adapt their business models. The import checks will have a lasting impact on the trade relations between the EU and the UK. And there are long-term consequences. Companies could adapt their supply chains and focus on new markets, but these just-in-time things will not always work like this. But different standards and regulations could lead to even more distortions of competition. And in some areas, such as research or environmental policy, there could be increased cooperation still. The relationship between the EU and the UK is indeed in a dynamic process, and import checks are only one aspect of the new trade relationship. Future developments will depend on political decisions, but also economic conditions and global trends. And both sides could deepen their cooperation in certain areas to pursue common interests. And what Labour wants is to get new trade agreements to facilitate trade and regulate certain sectors. But there is a risk of conflict, particularly in the interpretation and implementation of the TCA as well. The introduction of import checks was an unavoidable consequence of Brexit, and the effects of these checks are diverse and complex. Companies and consumers must both adapt to the new framework and adapt their business models and their shopping behavior. And the long-term consequence of Brexit will only become apparent in a number of years to come. And still, we all know the Northern Ireland Protocol is an integral part of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement negotiated as part of Brexit. It aims to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, which is a member state of the EU, while preserving the integrity of the EU internal market. But why is Northern Ireland such a special case? The Northern Ireland Protocol must take into account the provisions of the so-called Good Friday Agreement, which initiated a historic peace process on the island of Ireland in 1998. A hard border would endanger the fragile stability in the region. Northern Ireland, as part of the UK, and Ireland as a EU member state, need to ensure the free movement of goods within the EU internal market, and for that special arrangement had to be made for Northern Ireland. The implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol presents numerous challenges, though. In order to ensure the free movement of goods between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, customs checks should not actually be carried out at that border. At the same time, goods entering the rest of the UK from Northern Ireland may need to undergo customs clearance, and vice versa, and this leads to complex customs formalities and sometimes checks within the UK. And the EU has higher food standards than the UK, and to ensure the free movement of goods, food entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain needs to meet EU standards. And this leads to additional costs and bureaucratic hurdles for businesses. We have the Windsor framework now, which made clear that there are green lanes for stuff that only stays in Northern Ireland, but the radical, what do you call the factions in Northern Ireland are still not happy about this, because there are still checks on things that are going to the EU, that means via Northern Ireland into Ireland, and we all know the not for EU sticker now that let's say damaged the confidence of people purchasing this stuff, and we will definitely talk about Northern Ireland and the Windsor framework again, depending on future election results. Nevertheless, if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.